I cannot remember my own wife's funeral. I cannot remember signing away 3 of my warehouses last month. But I will never forget the moment I found my pregnant daughter-in-law starving on a boat dock in the pouring rain, scrubbing hulls for $8 an hour. What she whispered next didn't just unravel my son's lies. It explained why my own mind had been dissolving like salt in the sea for the past 9 months. Before I reveal the truth that shattered my world, please hit like, subscribe, and comment. Where are you watching from today? Wherever you are, please take care of your health. Note: this is a fictional story crafted to explore betrayal and survival. The message carries genuine significance. Now, let's continue. The pen felt like a dead fish in my hand. Cold, slippery, and completely wrong. I sat in the harbor master's office at Fisherman's Terminal, staring at a $2.1 million contract that should have been the simplest signature of my career. The numbers swam on the page like frightened minnows, scattering every time I tried to focus. I am Raymond Hale, 60 years old, chairman of Hale Maritime Logistics, a company I built from a single leaking tugboat into a $45 million shipping empire stretching from Puget Sound to the Panama Canal. My hands have hauled anchor chains and shaken the hands of senators. Yet here I sat, unable to remember why I had driven to this terminal in the first place. Across the desk, Victor Langston, my business partner of 18 years, drummed his manicured fingers against the wood. His 53-year-old face carried the impatience of a man who counted time in billable quarters. "Raymond, you've been holding that pen for 4 minutes." His voice sliced through the haze. "The Koreans won't wait forever. Is there a problem?" "Just the fluorescence, Victor." I managed, my voice thin and hollow like wind through an empty cargo hold. My eyes aren't what they used to be, a lie I had been telling for months. The truth was far more terrifying. Entire days had been vanishing from my memory, like ships sailing into fog and never returning. Last Tuesday, I woke in my study with no recollection of the previous 48 hours. My son Connor told me I had agreed to transfer Warehouse 7 to a new investment fund. I had no memory of the conversation, but my signature sat on the paper. My own handwriting, my own consent that I could not recall giving. How does a man who built an empire on precision logistics lose his own mind one day at a time? "I need 5 minutes, Victor." I stood on unsteady legs. "Let me clear my head on the pier." I pushed through the heavy door into the November morning. The cold hit me like a wall of salt water, carrying the smell of brine, creosote, and rusting chains. Fisherman's Terminal stretched before me, a forest of masts I had known since boyhood. The wooden planks groaned under my weight as I walked deeper into the terminal, past my own fleet's green and white hulls, past the tourist charters, toward the maintenance docks where rental boats were hauled out for scrubbing. That is when I saw her, a figure on her hands and knees on the lower dock, scrubbing the barnacle-crusted hull of a sailboat with a wire brush. The posture was wrong for this kind of labor, too heavy in the middle, too careful in every shift of weight. She wore a thin gray sweatshirt offering nothing against the biting wind, her frame supporting a belly impossibly heavy for her narrow shoulders. Something in the rhythm of her scrubbing made me pause. It was not the efficient stroke of a dock worker earning a paycheck. It was the desperate, grinding motion of someone who could not afford to stop. Then she reached for a different brush, and her profile turned toward me in the gray light. My heart detonated. Elise Whitfield, 27 years old. My son's wife. The woman Connor had sworn to our entire family had stolen $200,000 and fled to British Columbia with a charter boat captain. She was supposed to be erased, a thief living on stolen money across the border. Instead, she was here, 8 months pregnant, on her knees in freezing rain, scrubbing boats at a dock I owned 60% of. The wire brush slipped from her cracked fingers and clattered against the hull. She looked up, startled by my boots on the planking, and our eyes met across 15 feet of wet timber and 9 months of lies. The recognition hit us both like an anchor dropped from height. Her hollow eyes went wide, the dark circles beneath them marking a woman who had not truly slept in months. Her cracked lips parted in a silent gasp that fogged the cold air. For one eternal second, we stared at each other across a truth about to split the world in half. Then she ran. Or tried to. Her swollen body turned the motion into a lurching, painful stumble toward the far end of the dock, her wet sneakers slipping on algae-slick planks. She grabbed a piling for balance, breathing ragged and visible. Each exhale a small cloud of desperation. I did not think about the contract. I did not consider Victor or the $2.1 million. I moved toward her with the instinct of a man who has spent 40 years reading the sea and knowing when something is about to capsize. Elise. My voice cut through the wind. Stop. Please. She stumbled again, hand flying to her belly as a sharp gasp escaped her. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself against the railing, knuckles white as bone on wet wood. I closed the distance. Close enough to see raw, chapped skin on her hands. Close enough to smell industrial degreaser and salt on her thin clothing. Close enough to see that the woman my son called a gold digger had not eaten a proper meal in weeks. She turned, back against the railing, trapped between the man who raised her tormentor and the cold gray water of the Sound. When she finally spoke, her voice was a cracked whisper the wind nearly stole. Please, Mr. Hale. Her teeth chattered violently. If you tell him you saw me, he won't just take the baby. He'll make sure I disappear for real this time. I stood in the rain, cold water soaking through my coat, and felt the first crack appear in the foundation of everything I believed about my own son. Her fingers dug into my coat sleeve with a strength that did not match her skeletal frame. The grip was pure adrenaline, the kind that comes from months of running on nothing but fear and the will to keep a heartbeat alive inside her womb. I did not pull away. I stood in the freezing rain, letting this ghost of a woman anchor herself to my arm, while the wind howled off Puget Sound and the distant clang of rigging filled the silence between us. Elise. I said her name softly, the way you speak to a wounded animal. I'm not going to call him. Breathe and tell me why you're here. She shook her head violently, scanning the dock behind my shoulder for threats that lived permanently in her peripheral vision. She pulled me into the narrow gap between two stacked shipping containers. The smell of rust and old seawater filled the confined space, rain drumming a metallic rhythm on the steel above. You think I left him? She rasped. Everyone thinks I left. That's exactly what he wanted. Connor told me you took $200,000, Elise. He said you ran with a man named Diego. A sound escaped her that was half sob, half bitter laugh. There is no Diego, Raymond. There never was. Your son invented a ghost to explain away the woman he was trying to bury. I pressed my palm against the cold steel wall as dizziness crept at the edges of my vision. That familiar gray tide, swallowing my focus. But I fought it. I forced my eyes to stay locked on hers. Then why 9 months of silence? She gripped her belly with both hands, a protective gesture so instinctive it looked like prayer. Because the night I tried to leave through the front door, he told me he would have me declared mentally unfit. He said he would take this baby and I would never hold my own child. He has papers drafted. A psychiatrist he pays. To say whatever he needs. Each word landed like a stone dropped into still water. I searched her face for deception and found nothing but hollow, raw-boned truth. But that's not the worst of it. Her voice dropped so low, I leaned in to hear it over the rain. I didn't just run because of the threats to me. I ran because of what I saw them doing to you. What do you mean, doing to me? Nicole Ashford. The name fell from her lips like a curse. She moved into Connor's guest room 6 months before I left. He told you she was a nutritional consultant. But I watched her, Raymond. Every morning I watched her put something into your water. A white powder from a vitamin bottle she keeps in the locked drawer of the kitchen island. My vision tunneled. Nicole Ashford. 30 years old. The smiling woman who prepared my daily water infusion with lemon and minerals. The woman my son introduced as a specialist for my energy levels. She's poisoning me. Not just poisoning. Erasing. Elise's teeth chattered so hard her words came out jagged. The drug is called scopolamine. In small doses, it steals your memory, makes you suggestible, makes you sign things you don't remember. And then your son fills in the blanks with whatever story he needs you to believe. How do you describe the moment you realize the fog in your mind was never nature's cruelty but your own child's architecture? It is not anger that comes first. It is vertigo. The sensation of standing on a floor quietly removed beneath your feet while you smiled at the carpenter. Every lost day. Every signed document I could not recall. Every morning waking with a skull, emptied and refilled with cotton. It was not aging. It was my son and his mistress dissolving me from the inside like salt in warm water. I tried to stop it. Elise continued, words tumbling like water through a cracked hull. One night, I switched her powder for cornstarch. But Nicole tasted the water the next morning and knew instantly. Her voice cracked. That night, Connor sat on the edge of my bed and said, if I ever interfered again, he would inject me with enough of that powder to make me forget my own name. Then he'd have me committed. I closed my eyes. Rain pounded the steel above us like a judge's gavel. How long has this been happening? 9 months. Since the week Nicole moved in, your dizzy spells started the same week. Every time you lost a day, Connor was right there the next morning, helping you remember, guiding you through paperwork, being the perfect, devoted son. The perfect, devoted son. The boy I taught to tie nautical knots and read tide charts. The man I handed my company's vice presidency because I believed blood was thicker than salt water. He had been hollowing me out like a shipworm inside a wooden hull, invisible, patient, lethal. There's more. Terror climbed another octave in her voice. I have a video. The night before Connor caught me, I used the house security cameras to record Nicole preparing your water. I saw her measure the powder and dissolve it. She clutched my arm. Connor found the footage and wiped the server. But I had already uploaded a copy to my personal cloud. The proof is still alive, Raymond. The wind shifted, carrying the bite of open ocean. Somewhere on the Sound, one of my ships was moving through the gray, guided by a crew that trusted the Hale name. And all this time, the harbor itself had been poisoned. If Connor finds out I still have that video, Elise whispered with the ferocity of a mother wolf, he won't just chase me. He'll finish it, and there will be no one left who knows what they're doing to you. I looked at her. 27 years old, 8 months pregnant, standing in the rain with nothing but a thin sweatshirt and a cloud password between her child and oblivion. Then I looked at my own trembling hands, the hands of a man too blind to see the rot in his own rigging. The dizziness retreated. For the first time in 9 months, my mind felt sharp, not healed, but pointed, like the bow of a ship turning to face the storm. Then we don't let him find out, I said, my voice dropping to the low register I used when navigating through gales. And we don't let him finish anything. The rain had soaked through every layer I wore, but I did not feel the cold. I felt only the white-hot wire of fury threading itself through my chest as Elise continued to dismantle the story my son had built around me like a coffin. I guided her deeper between the containers, shielding her from the wind with my body. Her teeth had not stopped chattering, and her lips carried a bluish tint that alarmed me. But she would not stop talking. It was as though 9 months of sealed silence had finally found a crack, and the pressure behind it would not allow her to close it again. You need to understand how it works, Raymond, she said, her voice a raw whisper against the metallic drumming above. It's not just the powder. The powder is only the eraser. Connor is the one who writes on the blank page. She described mornings I could not remember. How I would wake disoriented, my mind a clean slate wiped by the previous night's dose. Connor would appear within minutes, always with a warm smile and a cup of water that tasted faintly of citrus. He would sit beside me in my study and narrate my own life back to me. Dad, remember yesterday you agreed to move the Pacific Northwest accounts into the East Side Fund? Or, Dad, you signed the warehouse transfer last week, remember? You said it was time to consolidate, and I would nod. I would accept his version of my own history because the alternative, that my mind was truly failing, was too terrifying to examine. He rewrites your reality every single morning, Elise whispered. And you thank him for it. The nausea that rose in my throat had nothing to do with the poison. It was the sickness of a man realizing he has been thanking his executioner for sharpening the blade. And Nicole? I asked, my jaw tight enough to crack teeth. What exactly is she? Elise's expression darkened into something I had never seen on her gentle face. A hatred so concentrated it could have corroded steel. Nicole is not his girlfriend, Raymond. She is his weapon. He brought her into that house with one purpose. She's a former pharmacist, lost her license 3 years ago for manufacturing counterfeit prescriptions. Connor found her through a contact I never identified. Elise paused, swallowing hard. But she didn't just bring the drugs, she brought the system, the dosing schedule, the behavioral protocols. She knows exactly how much scopolamine to give you to erase a 12-hour window without triggering a medical emergency. I thought of Nicole's calm smile every morning as she handed me my water. The way she would touch my shoulder and say, "Drink up, Mr. Hale." Hydration is the foundation of cognitive health. I had trusted her because my son told me to trust her, and my son told me to trust her, because I could no longer trust my own memory to contradict him. A perfect closed loop of destruction. The architect erases the blueprint, then draws a new one in its place. There's something else you need to know, Elise continued, and her hand moved to her swollen belly in that protective cradle I was beginning to recognize as her default posture. Before I left, before Connor caught me with the cornstarch, Nicole had already started replacing me in that house. She described scenes that made my blood feel like ice water pumping through corroded pipes. Nicole wearing Elise's clothes, sitting in Elise's chair at the dinner table, using Elise's coffee mug, her perfume, her bath products. Connor encouraged it, sometimes openly laughing as Nicole paraded through the kitchen in a dress that still carried Elise's scent. She wore my anniversary necklace, Elise said, her voice flat with a trauma too deep for tears. The one you gave me at the company gala 2 years ago. The sapphire one. She wore it to breakfast while I was still sitting at the table, and Connor looked right at me and said, "It looks better on her, don't you think?" Is there a word for the moment a father realizes his son has become something that should never have been given a human name? I have captained vessels through typhoons and stared down Union strikes that threatened to bankrupt me. None of it prepared me for the seasickness of hearing my own blood described as a predator who dismantled his wife's identity piece by piece while she was still living inside it. The night I ran, Elise said, her voice dropping to barely a breath. Connor had gone to a business dinner. I thought I had 2 hours alone. I went to the kitchen, opened the locked drawer with a key I had copied weeks earlier, and took out Nicole's vitamin bottle. I replaced the scopolamine with cornstarch. I thought if I could just buy you a few clear days, you would notice something was wrong on your own. She closed her eyes. The memory clearly caused her physical pain. Nicole checked the bottle the next morning. She always checks. She tasted a grain of the powder and knew immediately. Elise's hand trembled against her belly. She didn't confront me, she told Connor. And that night, he came to my room. It was 11:45. I remember because I was watching the clock, counting the minutes until I could try again. Her voice became almost inaudible. He sat on my bed. He didn't raise his voice. He said, very calmly, that if I ever touched Nicole's supplies again, he would give me a dose large enough to erase everything. My name, my memories, my ability to recognize my own child after it was born. He said he would commit me to a facility where I would spend the rest of my life, not knowing I had ever been a mother. The steel container behind my back felt like the only solid thing left in the world. Everything else, my company, my home, my family name, had been revealed as hollow shells built over rot. I left that night, Elise said. 3 in the morning. I took nothing but my phone, one change of clothes, and the cloud password in my head. I walked 6 miles to a bus station in the rain. 8 weeks pregnant and terrified that every headlight behind me was Connor coming to make good on his promise. She looked up at me, and in her hollow eyes I saw not just a victim, but a soldier who had survived a war I never knew was being fought under my own roof. 9 months, Raymond. I've been hiding in this city for 9 months. Working docks, cleaning boats, sleeping in shelters when I could find a bed. All because I was too afraid to come to you. Because Connor told me you were already too far gone to believe anything I said. He told me you'd side with him. Because the drugs had already made you his. I looked at my own hands. The tremor that had plagued them for months was still there. A subtle vibration that I had attributed to stress and age. Now I knew its true name. It was the physical signature of my son's patience. Each tremor a testament to another dose successfully delivered, and another day successfully stolen. He was wrong about one thing, I said, and my voice carried a weight that surprised even me. I'm still here, Elise. And now that I know what he's built, I know exactly how to tear it down. I pulled out my phone with fingers that felt steadier than they had in months. The simple act of knowing, of finally understanding the shape of the enemy, had given my nervous system something it had been starved of: purpose. I dialed Thomas Wakefield, 52 years old. My driver, my dock foreman, and the only man in Seattle who had been with me longer than the barnacles on my oldest hull. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the gravelly calm of a man who had spent 30 years anticipating my needs before I voiced them. Thomas. Black Navigator. Fisherman's Terminal. Maintenance Dock. C. Now. No questions. 6 minutes, sir. He replied. The line went dead. No hesitation. No curiosity. That was Thomas. I turned back to Elise. She was leaning against the container wall, her energy visibly draining now that the adrenaline of confession had burned through its fuel. Her eyelids fluttered with exhaustion, and one hand pressed against the small of her back, where the weight of 8 months was taking its toll on a body running on fumes. Can you walk? I asked. I've been walking for 9 months, Raymond. She replied with a ghost of the sharp wit I remembered from family dinners that now felt like scenes from another man's life. I can manage another 100 yards. I shrugged off my overcoat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The wool swallowed her thin frame, and for a moment she looked like a child wearing her father's jacket. The thought sent a blade through my chest. She should have been my daughter. She was my daughter. And I had let her drown while I sat in my study signing away my own empire to the man holding her underwater. Thomas materialized exactly 6 minutes later, the black Lincoln Navigator pulling silently to the curb beside the maintenance gate. He stepped out, took one look at Elise's condition, and opened the rear door without a word. His face betrayed nothing, but I caught the slight tightening of his jaw. Thomas had known Elise. He had driven her to prenatal appointments back when the world still made sense. Bainbridge, I said as I helped Elise into the warm leather interior. The old house. Thomas met my eyes in the rearview mirror. The old house. The property I had purchased 23 years ago as a retreat for Helena and me, long before Connor was old enough to remember it existed. After Helena's death, I had kept it off every corporate record, maintained by a local caretaker, under a trust that bore no connection to the Hale name. It was the one place in the world my son could not find because he had never known it was there. The drive through Seattle was a blur of rain-slicked streets and neon reflections. Elise dozed against the window, her breathing shallow but steady, one hand resting on her belly even in sleep. I watched the city pass, the skyline I had helped shape with cargo and commerce, and wondered how many of those buildings I still actually owned. How many had Connor already transferred while I sat drooling in my study, nodding at whatever fabricated memory he fed me that morning. The ferry to Bainbridge Island departed at 4:15. I purchased the tickets under Thomas's name, paid cash, and kept my head low in the cabin as the vessel cut through the gray chop of Puget Sound. The smell of diesel and salt water usually brought me peace. Today it brought only the urgent awareness that every hour I spent in transit was an hour Connor might notice my absence. The island emerged from the mist like a dark green fortress, its Douglas firs standing sentinel against the November sky. Thomas drove the winding roads in silence until we reached the unpaved lane that led to the property. The house appeared through the trees, a craftsman-style structure of cedar and stone that Helena had fallen in love with at first sight. It smelled of wood smoke and pine needles, the caretaker having kept the fireplace stoked against the seasonal chill. I guided Elise inside and settled her onto the deep leather sofa in the living room. She sank into it as though the cushions were the first kind surface she had touched in 9 months. Which, I realized with a sickening clarity, they probably were. Thomas, call Dr. Whitmore. Tell him it's a private matter. House call. Tonight. Dr. Whitmore arrived within 90 minutes, his medical bag and his discretion both equally reliable. He was 61, semi-retired, and owed me a favor from a decade ago that neither of us had ever discussed aloud. He examined Elise in the guest bedroom while I paced the living room, the creak of old floorboards beneath my feet marking time like a metronome. When he emerged, his expression told me everything his words were about to confirm. Stage 2. Anemia. Severe protein deficiency. Dehydration, bordering on critical. He spoke quietly, his eyes carrying the particular gravity of a physician delivering news he wished he did not have to give. The baby appears stable for now, but the mother is running on reserves she exhausted weeks ago. Another 7 to 10 days of this, Raymond, and we would be having a very different conversation. 7 to 10 days. My daughter-in-law had been 7 to 10 days from dying on a dock I owned, scrubbing boats to earn enough for a meal. She probably skipped anyway, to save money for the baby. I thanked Whitmore, wrote him a check that ensured his silence, and returned to find Elise already asleep. Not the light, fitful sleep of a hunted woman, but the deep, boneless surrender of someone whose body had finally been given permission to stop running. Her face in the firelight looked younger than 27. It looked like the face of the girl Connor had brought home 4 years ago, bright and hopeful, before my son dismantled her one morning at a time. I pulled a wool blanket over her shoulders and sat in the armchair by the window, watching the last gray light fade over Puget Sound. The old house settled around us with familiar creaks, a wooden vessel riding gently at anchor. How much of my life had I spent building something my son could sell? 40 years of harbor cranes and shipping manifests, and the only cargo that mattered was asleep on my couch, carrying my grandson in a body I had nearly let starve to death. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and read the message on the screen. Connor's name. His words, glowing in the darkness of the room with a casual cruelty that made my stomach turn. Dad, where are you? You missed your evening water. Nicole is worried about your hydration. Come home soon, okay? Love you. Love you. The poison had a signature, and it always ended with those 2 words. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back with steady fingers. Got confused driving. Ended up at the marina. Thomas is bringing me home now. Sorry to worry you, son. The performance had begun. And this time, I was the one writing the script. The next morning I drove myself back to the house on Queen Anne Hill. Thomas offered to take me, but I needed the 40 minutes alone behind the wheel. I needed to rehearse. The Seattle skyline rose before me through the windshield, glass towers catching the weak November sun. I had spent 4 decades filling this city's harbors with cargo and commerce. Now I was about to walk into my own home and pretend to be a man whose mind was crumbling. The irony tasted like copper on my tongue. I parked in the circular driveway and sat for a moment, studying the facade of the house I had built for Helena 28 years ago. White, colonial pillars, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound. A home that once held laughter and the smell of her lavender perfume. Now it was a laboratory where my son conducted his quiet experiments on my consciousness. I let my shoulders slump. I softened my jaw. I allowed my eyes to drift slightly out of focus, practicing the vacant, searching expression I had apparently been wearing for months without knowing it was being manufactured. Then I opened the car door and shuffled toward the entrance with the careful, uncertain gait of a man who was not entirely sure he had come to the right address. Connor met me at the door. 33 years old, wearing a cashmere sweater, and the concerned smile of a devoted son. His hair was freshly cut, his posture relaxed. Dad, there you are. His voice carried that practiced warmth that used to fool me completely. We were worried sick. Thomas said, "You got confused near the marina?" "The marina," I repeated slowly, letting my brow furrow as if trying to locate the memory. "Yes. I think I was looking for something. One of the boats, maybe. I can't quite." Connor placed his hand on my shoulder, guiding me inside with a gentle pressure that felt less like affection and more like a shepherd steering livestock through a gate. "It's okay, Dad. You've been pushing yourself too hard with the Langston deal. Why don't you sit down? Nicole has your morning water ready." Nicole Ashford stood in the kitchen, backlit by the wide windows that faced the sound. 30 years old. Auburn hair pulled into a neat ponytail, wearing a cream-colored blouse that I now realized was one of Elise's. She smiled at me with teeth that gleamed like polished porcelain. Her hands wrapped around a tall glass of water infused with lemon and what appeared to be a dissolved mineral tablet. "Good morning, Mr. Hale." Her voice was honey poured over broken glass. "You look tired. Let's get your hydration started, shall we?" She set the glass before me on the kitchen island. The water was perfectly clear, the lemon wedge floating serenely on the surface. I stared at it the way a sailor stares at a reef he has been sailing over for months without knowing it could tear out his hull. I had to drink it. If I refused, if I changed any element of the routine they had built around my destruction, they would know something had shifted. The performance required absolute commitment to the character they had created for me. The confused old man, who trusts his son and his son's nutritionist. I picked up the glass. My hand trembled, and this time the tremor was genuine, though not for the reasons they believed. I raised it to my lips. The water tasted faintly of citrus and something else, something clean and almost metallic that I had always attributed to the mineral supplement. Scopolamine. I was tasting my own erasure. I took 2 small sips, just enough to wet my lips and satisfy their observation. Then I set the glass down and pressed my fingers to my temple. "Bit of a headache this morning," I murmured. "I think I'll take this to my study." Connor nodded, already turning back to his phone. Nicole watched me with those sharp, assessing eyes for a moment longer before returning to the counter. I carried the glass down the hallway, my steps deliberately unsteady, and closed the study door behind me. The moment the latch clicked, I moved with precision. I pulled an empty vitamin bottle from my jacket pocket, one I had sterilized and sealed the night before at the Bainbridge house. I poured the remaining water into it, capped it tightly, and slid it into the inner pocket of my coat. Evidence. The first physical proof of what Elise had told me in the rain. I replaced the glass with tap water and a squeeze of lemon, then set it on my desk, as though I had been sipping absently while reading. The details mattered. Every detail mattered now. I sat in my leather chair and let my eyes drift to the bookshelf across the room. Something was different. A gap on the 3rd shelf where a framed photograph used to stand. Helena and me at the christening of our first commercial vessel, the Pacific Monarch. I had looked at that photo every morning for 15 years. I rose slowly and walked to the shelf. The frame was gone. I checked the desk drawers. Nothing. Then I noticed a cardboard box tucked behind the armchair in the corner, half hidden by a throw blanket. I lifted the lid. Inside, face down, lay the photograph. Beneath it were 3 more frames. Helena, at our anniversary dinner. Helena holding newborn Connor. Helena and me, on the deck of the yacht she named after herself. He was erasing her too. Removing my wife from my own study one frame at a time, betting that my poisoned mind would simply forget they had ever been there. How do you mourn a son who is still breathing? Is there a funeral for the version of them that you believed existed? I stood holding my dead wife's photograph, staring at the face of the baby in her arms, and tried to locate the exact moment that infant became the creature currently dismantling my world from the inside. I replaced the box and returned to my chair, careful to leave everything exactly as I had found it. The performance demanded patience. Every premature move was a leak in the hull that could sink the entire operation before I had gathered enough evidence to make it watertight. 30 minutes later, I heard Connor's voice drifting from the living room. He was on the phone, speaking in the low, confident tone of a man conducting business he believed was already won. The petition should be ready by the 20th, he said. Once the neurologist signs off on cognitive decline, we file for emergency guardianship. Full power of attorney. Medical, financial, everything. A pause. Then a laugh that sounded like a door slamming shut. Relax. He doesn't even remember what day it is. By Christmas, I'll have full control of Hale Maritime, and he'll be watching seagulls in a care facility, wondering why nobody visits. I sat perfectly still in my study, the vitamin bottle of poisoned water pressed against my chest, and let my son's laughter wash over me like freezing spray over the bow of a ship that has finally turned to face the wave. By Christmas, he said. I had 5 weeks to dismantle everything he had built on the ruins of my mind. 5 weeks before the son I raised tried to bury me in paperwork and pharmaceutical fog. It would be enough. The vitamin bottle sat in my coat pocket like a grenade with the pin already pulled. I could feel its weight against my ribs as I drove south on Interstate 5, the Seattle skyline shrinking in my rearview mirror. Every mile I put between myself and the house on Queen Anne Hill felt like surfacing from deep water, the pressure in my chest releasing one atmosphere at a time. Dr. Sandra Okafor's private laboratory occupied the second floor of a nondescript brick building on Capitol Hill, tucked between a yoga studio and a Vietnamese bakery. She was 55, Nigerian-born, Oxford-trained, and possessed a clinical detachment that bordered on the surgical. I had found her through a maritime insurance contact who described her as the kind of toxicologist who could identify poison in a saint's bloodstream and never tell a soul. She met me at the door with no greeting beyond a raised eyebrow and a gloved hand extended for the sample. Her lab smelled of rubbing alcohol and ozone, the air humming with the white noise of centrifuges and refrigeration units. How quickly can you identify what's in this? I asked, handing her the vitamin bottle. She held it to the fluorescent light, tilting it with the practiced eye of a woman who had spent decades reading the invisible signatures of toxins. If it's organic, 48 hours. If it's pharmaceutical, I'll have preliminary results by tonight. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. Should I also be running a blood panel on you, Mr. Hale? Yes. I rolled up my sleeve without hesitation. And Sandra, whatever you find, does not leave this room. The needle slid into my vein with a cold, biting clarity. I watched my own blood fill the vial, dark and sluggish, and wondered how much of that darkness was chemistry rather than age. She called me at 9:17 that evening. I was sitting in the Bainbridge house, watching Elise sleep in the warm glow of the fireplace, when my phone vibrated against the arm of the chair. Scopolamine, Sandra said without preamble. High-purity pharmaceutical grade, not street level. The water sample contains approximately 0.8 milligrams per liter, which is a precise dosing designed for sustained cognitive suppression without acute toxicity. Whoever formulated this knows exactly what they're doing. I closed my eyes. Hearing the name confirmed by science felt different from hearing it from Elise in the rain. This was the cold, mathematical reality of my murder, rendered in molecular notation. Your blood work is worse, Sandra continued, her voice dropping a register. Chronic exposure. 6 to 9 months based on metabolite accumulation. Your hippocampus is being systematically degraded. Raymond, if this continues for another 60 days, the memory damage will cross into permanent territory. 60 days. Connor's guardianship deadline was 5 weeks. He was racing to own me legally before the drug destroyed me biologically. A perfect timeline where the poison did the work and the paperwork buried the evidence. Can it be reversed? I asked. If we start chelation and nootropic therapy immediately, yes. Most of the damage is still functional rather than structural. But you cannot alert whoever is doing this. The moment they suspect intervention, they may escalate the dosage. I thanked her, memorized her treatment protocol, and hung up. Then I sat in the dark, listening to the fire crackle and the distant wash of Puget Sound against the island shore. The science was clear. I was being murdered in slow motion by my own son, and the clock was already running. The next morning I drove to Pioneer Square. Patricia Dunn operated from a third-floor office above a bookshop, her space cluttered with filing cabinets and the constant blue glow of multiple monitors. She was 47, razor-thin, with the intense focus of a bloodhound given a fresh trail. Forensic accounting was not just her profession. It was her obsession. I had brought her the financial records I could still access from Hale Maritime's secondary systems, files Connor had apparently overlooked in his assumption that my degraded mind would never think to check them. Patricia worked in silence for 3 hours while I sat drinking coffee that tasted like freedom simply because no one had poisoned it. When she finally turned from her screens, her face was ashen. "It's worse than embezzlement, Raymond," she said, her voice a controlled blade. "It's systematic asset stripping. $890,000 routed through 4 shell companies, all registered under variations of Nicole Ashford's maiden name. The transfers coincide precisely with your documented medical episodes." She pulled up a personnel file. "There's more. 6 months ago, 2 senior dock foremen were terminated for theft. Dan Kowalski and Jake Reeves. The evidence against them was submitted by Connor personally. She cross-referenced the termination dates with the siphon transactions. The money that supposedly went missing under their watch was actually transferred out by Connor using their employee credentials while they were on scheduled shore leave. He framed them. Dan Kowalski, 30 years old, father of 2. Jake Reeves, 28, newly married. I had looked those men in the eyes and called them thieves. I had signed their termination papers and felt righteous doing it. The guilt that washed through me was a cold, brackish tide that left salt in my throat. "One more thing," Patricia said, her monitor reflecting blue against her pale face. "Connor amended your corporate life insurance policy 11 weeks ago, using biometric data from your tablet during what appears to have been a drug-induced sleep episode. He forged your digital authorization. The accidental death rider has been increased to $8 million, with a specific clause covering cognitive decline leading to fatal complications. $8 million. The price my son had placed on the remaining years of my life. He's not just stealing from you, Raymond," Patricia whispered. "He's monetizing your death." I sat in silence, letting the numbers settle into my bones like ballast. Then Patricia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing at something new on her screen. "Raymond, there's one more anomaly." She clicked through several purchase records. "Nicole has been buying airline tickets over the past 3 weeks. International routes. São Paulo, then Lisbon. Always 2 seats." She looked up at me. "Only 2 seats. There's no booking for Connor on any of them." The implication landed like a depth charge, detonating beneath the waterline. Nicole was not planning to share the spoils with my son. She was planning to disappear with the money, while Connor stayed behind holding the bag. The puppet was being played by its own handler. My son was not just a predator. He was also prey. And he had no idea the woman sharing his bed was already planning to leave him with nothing but a prison sentence and an empty offshore account. I stood up from Patricia's desk, my joints protesting but my mind sharper than it had been in months. The treatment was already working. Every hour without the scopolamine was another hour of clarity returned. "Keep digging, Patricia," I said from the doorway. "I want every penny mapped, every signature traced. And Patricia, find out what happened to Dan and Jake. I owe those men more than an apology." The first detox pill had a bitter, chalky taste that I welcomed like communion wine. I stood in the bathroom of the Bainbridge house at 5:30 in the morning, watching my own gray face in the mirror as I swallowed the nootropic capsule Dr. Okafor had prescribed. It was hidden inside my daily multivitamin bottle, indistinguishable from the fish oil tablets I had taken for years. Even if Connor searched my belongings, he would find nothing but an old man's supplements. Every morning I took the antidote. Every morning I drove back to Queen Anne Hill and accepted the poisoned water from Nicole's steady hands. I would press the glass to my lips, take the smallest sip possible, then carry the rest to my study where it went down the bathroom sink. The performance required me to deteriorate. So, I deteriorated. I began forgetting Connor's name. Not every time, just often enough to make him smile. I would stare at him across the breakfast table, my brow furrowed, and say, "I'm sorry. You look so familiar. Are you one of the dock supervisors?" The first time I did it, his eyes lit up with a satisfaction so naked it made my stomach turn. He exchanged a glance with Nicole that said, "It's working faster now. I misplaced my keys in the refrigerator." I wore mismatched shoes to a board meeting that Connor had to cancel on my behalf, apologizing to the directors with the solemn face of a dutiful son, burdened by his father's decline. I wandered into the garden at 2 in the morning and let Thomas find me there, shivering and confused, because I knew Connor had cameras in the hallway. Each performance was a nail I was driving into the coffin they had built for me. But I was building a different box entirely, and they were climbing inside it willingly. While I crumbled for their cameras, my real work happened in the shadows. I met Frank Callahan in a subterranean parking garage beneath Pike Place Market on a Tuesday afternoon. The space smelled of exhaust fumes and damp concrete, the fluorescent lights casting everything in the sickly green of a morgue. Frank was 51, former Navy SEAL, a private investigator who operated with the ethical flexibility of a man who believed justice and law were cousins, not twins. He stood beside a black sedan, arms crossed, his weathered face showing nothing as I laid out the situation. "I need surveillance on Nicole Ashford," I told him. "Physical tail, financial tracking, and I need to know where she's sourcing the scopolamine." Frank didn't blink. "Budget? Unlimited." He nodded once, a gesture that contained the entire conversation's conclusion. "Give me 72 hours. He delivered in 48. The encrypted file arrived on a burner tablet I kept locked in the Bainbridge house. I opened it at midnight, the blue glow illuminating my face in the silence of the study, while Puget Sound whispered against the island shore outside. Nicole had been purchasing her supplies from an industrial chemical distributor in Tacoma, a company that sold pharmaceutical-grade compounds to research institutions. The purchase orders were signed under the name Jake Reeves, using a scanned copy of his employee identification that Connor had retained after terminating him. She had turned a framed man into an unwitting accomplice in his own former boss's murder. Frank's surveillance photographs showed her entering the facility, wearing oversized sunglasses and a baseball cap, her auburn hair tucked beneath the collar of a dark jacket. The security camera footage from the distributor's parking lot captured her license plate clearly. Connor's Audi. She was not even trying to hide the connection because she believed no one was watching. But Frank had captured something else. A second meeting, 3 days later, at a waterfront bar in Tacoma. Nicole sitting across from a man Frank identified as Dmitry Volkov, a 44-year-old freelance contractor with a criminal record that included aggravated assault and breaking and entering. Money changed hands beneath the table. An envelope passed from Nicole to Volkov. "She's hiring muscle," Frank told me over the encrypted line. I ran Volkov's recent movements. He's been doing reconnaissance on the Bainbridge Island ferry schedule and the roads near your property. The fortress had been found. Nicole did not know about the house specifically, but she knew I was hiding something on that island. Perhaps she had tracked Thomas's ferry purchases. Perhaps she had simply followed the trail of my absences. Either way, the clock had just accelerated. I needed to move faster. But first, I needed to tighten the legal noose. The following Monday, Connor presented me with another set of documents at the breakfast table. His tone was patient and patronizing, the voice of a man speaking to a child. "Dad, these are just routine maintenance contracts for the Tacoma fleet. Nothing complicated. Just your signature on the bottom line." I fumbled the pen. I squinted at the pages with theatrical confusion. I asked him 3 times what the document said, letting him explain it slowly while Nicole watched from the kitchen with her arms crossed and her lips curled in a thin smile. Then I signed. But I did not sign what he thought I was signing. 3 days earlier, my attorney, Marcus Webb, 60 years old and sharp enough to cut glass, had prepared a set of documents identical in appearance to the maintenance contracts Connor planned to present. Thomas had intercepted the original documents from Connor's briefcase while he slept and delivered them to Webb's office. Webb replaced the legal content while preserving the formatting exactly. What Connor now held was not a maintenance agreement. It was a formal acknowledgement that he, Connor Hale, held sole fiduciary responsibility for all fund transfers executed under Raymond Hale's credentials during the past 9 months. Connor had just co-signed his own confession. He smiled as he collected the papers, patted my shoulder, and told me I was doing great. "Thanks, Dad. I'll handle everything from here. You just rest." I watched him walk away, the papers tucked under his arm like a trophy. He had no idea he was carrying the blueprint of his own prison. That evening, back on Bainbridge, I received Frank's final urgent message. The words glowed on the burner tablet in the dark. "Raymond, Volkov just purchased a set of marine bolt cutters and a prepaid phone. He's been watching the Bainbridge ferry terminal for 2 days. Nicole met with him again this morning. Cash payment. Larger envelope this time. Whatever she's planning for that island, it's happening soon." I stared at the message, then looked toward the guest bedroom where Elise slept with one hand resting on her belly. The sanctuary was no longer safe. The wolf was circling, and she had hired teeth sharper than her own. There is a difference between surviving and living. For 3 weeks, I had been surviving. Gathering evidence, performing frailty, building a legal cage around my son's throat. Every waking hour was a tactical calculation, a move on a chessboard where the stakes were measured in blood and betrayal. But that Thursday evening on Bainbridge Island, I remembered what living felt like. Elise was sitting in the armchair by the fireplace when I arrived, her feet tucked beneath a wool blanket, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. The color had returned to her cheeks over the past weeks. Dr. Whitmore's iron supplements and the simple mercy of 3 meals a day had pulled her back from the edge of the cliff she had been standing on for 9 months. She was not yet strong, but she was no longer dying. There was a difference. "You look different tonight," she said as I hung my coat by the door. "Less like a man at war. Maybe I'm tired of the trenches," I replied, settling into the chair across from her. The fire crackled between us, and the smell of cedar smoke filled the room with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "Tell me something, Elise. Something that has nothing to do with Connor or Nicole or shell companies." She smiled. It was small and tentative, like a plant pushing through concrete, but it was real. "The baby kicks hardest when I listen to classical music. Beethoven especially. The louder movements make him go wild." "Him?" The ultrasound confirmed it last month. "A boy." She looked down at her belly, her hands resting on the curve with a tenderness that made the room feel sacred. "I've been thinking about names, but it felt wrong to choose one when everything was still so uncertain." I leaned forward in my chair. "May I?" I asked, gesturing toward her belly with a hesitance that surprised me. I had built a shipping empire, negotiated with governments, survived a typhoon off the coast of Taiwan. Yet asking to touch my own grandson felt like the most vulnerable thing I had ever done. She nodded, guiding my hand to the left side where she said the kicks were strongest. I pressed my palm against the warm cotton of her robe and waited. Nothing at first. Just the steady rhythm of her breathing and the pop of the fire. Then I spoke, some nonsense about the weather or the tide schedule, and it happened. A sharp, solid thump against my palm. Not a flutter. Not a ripple. A kick. Definitive, forceful, and unmistakably alive. A tiny heel or fist announcing its presence with the confidence of someone who had already decided they belonged in this world. My breath caught. I had built harbors and launched vessels and signed contracts worth more than most men earn in a lifetime. None of it compared to the electricity of that single defiant kick against my calloused hand. "He kicks harder when you talk," Elise whispered, watching my face with eyes that glistened in the firelight. "He already knows your voice." I kept my hand there, feeling the second kick. Then a third. Each one a small earthquake in the geography of my chest. This was not a stone legacy to be managed, or a hail asset to be protected. This was a person, a human being who deserved a name spoken with love rather than strategy. "Liam," I said, and the word fell from my mouth before I had consciously chosen it. My father's name. He was the first Hale to captain a vessel on Puget Sound, 1953, a fishing trawler called the Morning Star. Elise tested the name on her tongue. "Liam Hale," she said softly. "It sounds like someone steady, someone who knows how to hold on. That's exactly what a Hale should be," I replied, my voice rough with an emotion I had not permitted myself in weeks. Someone who holds on. We sat in the quiet for a long time after that. The fire burned low, and Elise told me about the early days with Connor. Before Nicole. Before the poison. She described a man who used to bring her wildflowers from the garden and read poetry aloud in terrible accents that made her laugh until her stomach hurt. A man who cried at their wedding and promised her the world. "What happened to him?" she asked. Not accusingly, but with a genuine sorrow that cut deeper than anger ever could. I stared into the embers. The honest answer was one I had been avoiding since the moment Elise first spoke his name in the rain. What happened to Connor was me. I happened to him. 40 years of building an empire and never once sitting in a chair like this, by a fire, simply being present with the people who needed me. I gave him everything money could buy and nothing that money could not. I built him a kingdom, but forgot to teach him that a crown means nothing without a conscience beneath it. I failed him, I said. The words were simple and inadequate, but they were true. I built ships instead of a son. Elise reached across the space between our chairs and squeezed my hand. "You're building something now, Raymond. That counts." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to sit in this warmth forever, listening to Liam kick against the world and pretending that the darkness outside these walls was not closing in. But the universe, as always, had other plans. The security panel in the hallway emitted a single, sharp beep. Then another. The perimeter alarm. I had installed it the week after bringing Elise here. A motion detection system covering the tree line and the access road. I rose from the chair, my body shifting from grandfather to general in the space of a heartbeat. The tablet connected to the security feed sat on the kitchen counter. I crossed the room in 4 strides and tapped the screen. 4 camera angles appeared in ghostly green night vision. There. Northeast quadrant. At the tree line where the Douglas firs met the edge of the property's clearing. A figure standing motionless in the shadows. The infrared outline showed broad shoulders and something held to the face. Binoculars. My phone rang. Thomas. Calling from the caretaker's cottage 50 yards east. "Sir, there's a man at the tree line." His voice was low and controlled. The voice of a man who had spent decades reading threats on dark waters. "He's been there for 40 minutes. Black jacket. No vehicle visible on the access road. He came on foot through the woods. Dmitry Volkov." or one of his people. Nicole's hired teeth had found the island. They had not found the house yet, not specifically, but they were close enough to smell us through the trees. I looked back at Elise. She had heard the alarm. Her hand was pressed flat against her belly, her eyes wide, with the particular terror of a woman who knows that the thing hunting her has caught the scent. "Pack a bag," I said quietly. "Only what matters. We may need to move." The sanctuary had a shelf life, and it had just expired. 3 days passed in a state of armed vigilance. Frank Callahan confirmed that Volkov had returned to the mainland after his reconnaissance, likely reporting back to Nicole. We had a window, but it was closing like a hatch in rising water. I doubled the motion sensors and had Thomas sleep with a satellite phone within arm's reach. Then the sky turned black. The National Weather Service issued the warning at 6 in the morning. A Pacific storm system pushing inland with sustained winds of 55 knots and gusts exceeding 70. Small craft advisory. Ferry service suspended until further notice. Bainbridge Island, for the next 12 to 18 hours, would be cut off from the mainland by a wall of wind and churning gray water. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the first bands of rain sweep across Puget Sound, like curtains being drawn across a stage. The Douglas firs along the property line were already bending, their ancient trunks groaning against the pressure. The power flickered once, twice, then held. The backup generator hummed to life in the basement, a mechanical heartbeat beneath the house. Elise appeared in the doorway behind me. She was holding her lower back with both hands, her face carrying an expression I did not immediately recognize. "Raymond," she said, and her voice had changed. It was not the voice of a woman making conversation. It was the voice of a body, delivering a message that overrode every other consideration. "Something's happening." I turned. Her face was pale beneath the warm light of the kitchen, and a dark stain was spreading across the gray fabric of her sweatpants. Her water. 3 weeks early. "How long?" I asked, crossing the room in 2 strides. "Contractions started an hour ago." I thought they were just the practice ones. She gripped the doorframe as a wave hit her, her knuckles going white. "They're not practice anymore, Raymond." The island was sealed. The ferry was suspended. The nearest hospital was across 8 miles of storm-churned water that the Coast Guard had declared impassable for standard vessels. And somewhere in the tree line, a man with bolt cutters might still be watching. I had navigated worse odds, but never with stakes this high. "Thomas," I called, my voice carrying the command register that had once directed crews through hurricanes. He appeared from the hallway within seconds, already reading my face. "The Riptide. Is she fueled?" Thomas's eyes went wide for a fraction of a second before the old discipline took over. The Riptide was my personal 32-foot offshore cruiser, moored at the private dock behind the property. She was built for rough water, her twin diesel engines capable of pushing through seas that would swallow lesser boats. I had used her for sport fishing, in conditions that made other captains stay in port. "Full tank as of yesterday, sir. But those waves out there are running 8 to 10 feet. I've seen you handle 12, Thomas." He nodded once. "I'll warm the engines." I guided Elise to the sofa and wrapped her in a heavy blanket. Her contractions were coming every 7 minutes now, each one pulling a sharp gasp from her clenched jaw. Between waves of pain, she looked at me with eyes that held both terror and absolute trust. The combination nearly broke me. "We're going to cross the Sound," I told her, my hands steady on her shoulders. 25 minutes in rough water. "Thomas and I have done this run 100 times. Liam is going to be born in a hospital, Elise. I promise you that." She nodded, biting her lip against another contraction. "Then let's go, before he decides to come without a doctor." Thomas had the Riptide rumbling at the dock by the time I half-carried Elise down the rain-soaked path. The wind hit us like a solid wall, carrying salt spray that stung our faces and made every breath a fight. The boat rocked violently at her mooring, the dock lines groaning like living things against the cleats. I lifted Elise over the gunwale and settled her into the enclosed cabin. wrapping her in life jackets and every blanket I could find. The diesel exhaust and salt air mixed with the metallic scent of rain as Thomas cast off the lines and throttled forward into the gray chaos. The first wave hit us broadside before we cleared the breakwater. The riptide rolled 30 degrees, and I heard Elise cry out from the cabin. I braced myself against the helm console, one arm extended to keep her wedged safely against the bench seat. Straight through the gut, Thomas. I shouted over the roar of wind and engine. No skirting. We don't have time for the long route. He leaned into the wheel, his face set in the grim concentration of a man who had grown up pulling crab pots in weather that killed careless fishermen. The bow rose on a swell and crashed down, sending a wall of white water over the windshield that momentarily blinded us. Between Elise's contractions and the thundering impacts of the waves, I kept time. 7 minutes between pains. Then 6. Then 5. Liam was not waiting for calm seas. We were halfway across, the lights of Seattle beginning to glow through the curtain of rain ahead, when I saw it. A light behind us. Not the random flash of a navigation buoy or the sweep of a lighthouse beam. It was the concentrated, bouncing glare of a vessel running at high speed, without proper running lights. I grabbed the binoculars from the overhead rack and pressed them to my eyes, fighting to keep the lenses steady against the pitch and roll. Through the rain and spray, I could make out the silhouette. A rigid, inflatable military style, running dark, too fast for a pleasure craft, too deliberate for a lost fisherman. Someone was following us through the storm. Thomas, I said, and the steel in my voice cut through the engine roar. He glanced at the radar screen mounted beside the wheel. A blip. Closing distance. 1 nautical mile astern, and gaining. I see it, sir. Thomas's jaw tightened. They're faster than us in these conditions. That RIB can handle the chop better than our hull. Elise screamed from the cabin. Not fear this time. Pain. A contraction that bent her double and left her gasping. 4 minutes apart now. I looked at the pursuing vessel, then at the woman in the cabin, then at the dark, churning water between us and the mainland. The reef passage, I said. Goat Island Channel. You know the gap. Thomas turned his head sharply. Sir, in this weather, those rocks will... You grew up fishing that channel, Thomas. You know the marks. That RIB draws too much speed to navigate it safely. They'll have to go around, or risk tearing their hull. He stared at me for 1 long second. Then he spun the wheel hard to port, and the riptide heeled over as we cut toward the dark, jagged shadow of Goat Island, rising from the storm like the spine of a sleeping dragon. Behind us, the pursuing light hesitated. Then it followed. The Goat Island Channel was a graveyard in calm weather. In a storm like this, it was a meat grinder of black rock and white water that only a man who had mapped every tooth of it since childhood would dare attempt. Thomas did not hesitate. His hands moved on the wheel, with the instinctive precision of muscle memory carved by 30 years of fishing these waters. Left past the first marker, a barnacle-crusted post barely visible above the surge. Hard right at the submerged shelf where the kelp beds marked the edge of the reef. Straight through the gap that looked impossibly narrow as the swells lifted us and dropped us like a toy in a bathtub. The riptide's hull scraped something beneath the waterline. A sound like fingernails on slate that made my teeth ache. But Thomas held course, threading us through the needle's eye while the storm tried to slam us against the rocks on either side. I looked back through the rain-blurred stern window. The RIB's light had stopped at the channel entrance. It hovered there for 10 seconds. 15. The operator clearly weighing the risk. Then it turned. The light swept north, taking the long route around Goat Island. By the time they cleared the passage, we would have 20 minutes of lead. We're through, sir, Thomas called, his voice carrying a tremor he would never admit to later. Clear water to the mainland. Elise's scream from the cabin made both of us flinch. 3 minutes between contractions now. Liam was coming whether we reached a hospital or not. I crouched beside her in the pitching cabin, one hand bracing against the overhead while the other gripped hers. Her face was slick with sweat and sea spray. Her jaw clenched so tight, I could hear her teeth grinding. Between contractions, she panted with short, controlled breaths that told me some primal part of her brain had taken over the operation. 8 minutes to the dock, Elise, I told her, keeping my voice steady despite the chaos. 8 minutes, and you'll have doctors and warm lights and everything Liam needs. He doesn't care about 8 minutes, Raymond. She gasped, a sound that was almost a laugh. He's a Hale. He comes when he's ready. Thomas pushed the riptide to her limit, the twin diesels screaming as we pounded across the final stretch of open water toward the city lights. Seattle rose from the storm like a cathedral of glass and steel. Its reflection shattered into 1,000 fragments on the churning surface of Elliott Bay. I had arranged emergency access to Virginia Mason Medical Center 3 weeks earlier. The moment I knew Elise's pregnancy was high risk. A substantial equipment donation to their neonatal unit had purchased discretion and a direct line to Dr. Amara Singh, a 45-year-old obstetrician whose reputation for handling crisis deliveries was matched only by her willingness to ask no questions when the price was right. Thomas brought the riptide alongside the hospital's restricted water ambulance dock at 11:23. The security gate opened after he flashed the badge I had obtained through channels that did not appear on any invoice. The dock lights blazed through the rain, and 2 nurses in yellow rain gear were already running toward us with a gurney. She's fully dilated, I shouted over the wind as they reached the boat. Contractions at 2 minutes. The baby is 3 weeks early. They moved with practiced urgency, lifting Elise from the cabin with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence of the storm around us. I followed the gurney through automatic doors that hissed shut behind us, cutting off the roar of the wind and replacing it with the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and medical machinery. Dr. Singh met us in the corridor, her dark eyes sharp and focused above her surgical mask. She assessed Elise in seconds, barking orders to her team with the calm authority of a woman who had delivered babies in far worse circumstances. "Mr. Hale, you wait here." She pointed to a plastic chair outside the delivery room. "I'll come to you when it's done." The door closed. I stood in the hallway, dripping seawater onto the linoleum, my ears ringing in the sudden silence. The fluorescent light buzzed above me like a mechanical prayer. Beyond the door, I could hear Elise's muffled cries and the steady, encouraging voice of Dr. Singh. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the observation window and watched. Elise, pale and drenched in sweat, pushed with everything her starved body had left. The nurses moved around her like choreographed dancers, their hands steady and sure. Then, at exactly 2:47 in the morning, a sound split the sterile air that made every other noise in my life feel like silence. A cry. High, indignant, and furious. The scream of a human being announcing his arrival to a world that had tried to prevent it. Dr. Singh lifted the baby into the light. Small. Red. Wrinkled. Perfect. His tiny fists punched the air as if fighting an enemy only he could see. His lungs filled and emptied with a ferocity that made me grip the window frame for support. When they finally let me in, Elise was propped against the pillows, exhaustion and joy fighting for control of her face. The bundle in her arms was impossibly small, wrapped in a blue hospital blanket that made his dark hair look even darker. 6 pounds. 1 ounce, Dr. Singh said, pulling her mask down to reveal a tired smile. Strong lungs. Strong grip. He grabbed my finger before I even finished cleaning him. I approached the bed slowly, my wet boots squeaking on the floor. Elise lifted Liam toward me, and I took him into my arms with hands that had held anchors and contracts and the weight of a $45 million empire. None of it had ever felt this heavy. None of it had ever felt this important. I looked down at his scrunched, sleeping face and noticed it immediately. There, on his left shoulder, partially hidden by the blanket's edge, a birthmark. Small, dark, shaped unmistakably like an anchor. The same mark my father had carried. The same mark I had traced with my finger as a boy when he held me on the deck of the Morning Star and told me that every Hale was born with the sea already in his blood. "Hello, Liam," I whispered, my voice breaking on the name. Your grandfather built harbors, but you are the harbor. He yawned. His tiny hand found my index finger and gripped it with a strength that had no business existing in something so small. I stood there, a 60-year-old man weeping silently in a hospital room at 3 a.m, holding the only thing in my life that no amount of money could have built. Then the burner phone in my coat pocket vibrated. I shifted Liam carefully back into Elise's arms and stepped to the corner of the room. The screen glowed with a message from an unknown number. An image. High resolution. Taken within the hour. Our boat, the Riptide, moored at the hospital dock, her hull still glistening with storm spray. The angle was from the parking structure across the street. Deliberate. Professional. Beneath the photo, 3 words. Nice boat, old man. Connor knew where we were. And Liam was less than 20 minutes old. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the plastic hospital chair with my coat still damp from the storm, watching the door of Elise's room the way a harbor master watches a channel during a squall. Every footstep in the corridor made my spine straighten. Every elevator chime made my hand move toward the phone in my pocket. By 5 a.m, I had made 3 calls. The first was to Frank Callahan, who confirmed that the photo had been taken by a telephoto lens from the 4th floor of the parking garage. Volkov's work. The second was to Thomas, who moved the Riptide to a public marina 6 blocks south, removing the most visible evidence of our presence. The third was to a woman named Margaret Chen, a real estate attorney who managed a portfolio of anonymous properties I had acquired over the decades for reasons I never expected to need. By 7, we were gone. Elise and Liam left Virginia Mason through the service basement in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse. I paid 3 months' salary to forget our faces. Thomas waited in a rented minivan with tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that disappeared into Seattle traffic like a raindrop into the Sound. The safe house was a 2-bedroom apartment on Capitol Hill, leased under a trust that bore no connection to the Hale name. It was above a Vietnamese restaurant, and the smell of faux broth and lemongrass seeped through the floorboards at all hours. It was not the Bainbridge house. It was not luxury, but it was invisible, and invisible was the only currency that mattered now. I settled Elise and Liam into the larger bedroom, watching as she nursed him for the first time in a space that did not smell of fear. His tiny mouth worked with the same determination his foot had shown against my palm, a Hale through and through. Stay here, I told her, pressing the burner phone into her hand. Thomas is downstairs. Do not answer the door for anyone whose voice you do not recognize. I will be back before dark. She looked up at me. Liam latched to her chest and nodded. There were no more questions between us. We had passed beyond the territory of explanation into the country of action. My first stop was the office of Marcus Webb, my attorney. The old man sat behind his mahogany desk with the stillness of a judge waiting to pass sentence as I explained what I needed. An irrevocable trust, I said. 49% of my personal shares in Hale Maritime. Beneficiary: Liam Hale, born last night. Trustee: Elise Whitfield Hale. The terms are simple. Even if Connor somehow claws his way to the top of this company, he will never hold a majority. The baby he tried to erase will own more of his father's ambition than his father ever will. Webb drafted the documents in 2 hours. I signed them with a hand that did not tremble. The ink felt like armor. My second stop was the federal building on 2nd Avenue. Agent Diana Torres of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division occupied a windowless office on the 9th floor that smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. She was 42, lean as a whippet, with dark eyes that processed information the way a computer processes code. No wasted cycles, no emotional interference. I sat across from her desk and laid out everything. The toxicology report from Dr. Okafor, Patricia Dunn's financial forensics, showing the $890,000 siphoned through shell companies, the surveillance footage of Nicole purchasing chemicals under a stolen identity, the insurance amendment forged with my biometric data, the legal trap Connor had already signed, without knowing, and the video on Elise's cloud, time-stamped and unedited, showing Nicole Ashford dissolving white powder into my morning water. Torres listened without interruption. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and was silent for exactly 12 seconds. I counted. "You want a controlled takedown," she said. It was not a question. I want them on tape, admitting it. I want them reaching for the prize with both hands, so deep in the cookie jar that no lawyer on earth can pull them free. Where? My yacht. The Helena. She's moored at Elliott Bay Marina. I'll invite them aboard for a final meeting. A surrender. Connor won't be able to resist the taste of a dying man waving the white flag. Torres nodded slowly. We'll wire the vessel. Directional microphones, pinhole cameras, full audio-visual capture. I'll have a tactical team on a Coast Guard cutter within 300 yards. When you give the signal, we move. And Nicole? I asked. If she runs, we'll have agents at every exit. The marina is a box. Once they're aboard, there's nowhere to go but the water. I shook her hand. Her grip was dry and firm. The handshake of a woman who had closed cases against men far more powerful than my son. That evening I sat alone on the deck of the Helena. She was a 54-foot motor yacht that my wife had named after herself with a laugh and a bottle of champagne 20 years ago. The teak deck still held the ghost of Helena's bare feet on summer afternoons. The brass fittings she had polished every Sunday still gleamed in the dock lights. This vessel was the last pure thing connected to my marriage, and I was about to use it as a trap to destroy our only child. The irony was a blade that cut both ways. I pulled out my phone and composed the message I had rehearsed in my mind for days. Every word chosen for maximum appeal to a man whose primary language was greed. Connor. I'm tired, son. The fog is getting worse. I can barely remember your mother's name some mornings. I don't want to fight anymore. Meet me on the Helena tomorrow at noon. Bring Nicole. I'll sign over everything. The company, the accounts, the fleet. All of it. It's time I rest. I just want peace before I forget what peace feels like. Love. Dad. I read it twice. Then I pressed send. The response came in 43 seconds. 43 seconds for my son to agree to claim the life's work of the man he was poisoning. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not suggest we talk first. He simply wrote, "We'll be there at noon. Get some rest, Dad. Tomorrow is a new beginning. A new beginning." For the first time, we agreed on something. I set the phone on the teak railing and looked out across Elliott Bay. The storm had passed, and the water lay flat and black beneath a sky full of stars that my poisoned mind had been too clouded to notice for months. Tomorrow, on this deck, in the place where Helena had once danced barefoot to radio static, I would face the monster I had raised and give him exactly what he deserved. Forgive me, Helena, I whispered to the water, for what I'm about to do to our boy. The stars said nothing. The harbor held its breath. The morning came wrapped in fog. A thick, silver-gray curtain that erased the Seattle skyline and reduced Elliott Bay to a world of muffled sound and ghostly shapes. The Helena rocked gently at her mooring, her teak deck slick with condensation, the brass fittings dulled by moisture that clung to every surface like a second skin. I stood in the main salon at 9 in the morning, 3 hours before the appointment. Frank Callahan's team had worked through the night, installing pinhole cameras in the overhead lighting fixtures, directional microphones behind the ventilation grills, and a fiber optic relay that transmitted everything in real time to Agent Torres and her team aboard a Coast Guard cutter anchored 300 yards off the marina's breakwater. I tested my mark. The mahogany desk in the salon where I would sit, positioned so that both chairs across from me fell within the optimal recording angle. I placed the toxicology report in the top drawer, Patricia's financial audit in the second, the surveillance photographs of Nicole at the chemical supplier in the third. Layered evidence, to be revealed in sequence, each one a deeper cut than the last. At 11:45, I took my position. I let my shoulders sag. I softened my jaw and allowed my eyes to drift into that unfocused, searching gaze I had been performing for weeks. I placed a half-empty glass of water on the desk beside me, a prop suggesting I had already taken my morning dose. The tremor in my hand was manufactured, but convincing. I was Raymond Hale, 60 years old, dying, confused, ready to surrender. At exactly noon, footsteps echoed on the dock. 2 sets, one confident, almost jaunty, the other measured and precise. The sound of a predator and its handler approaching what they believed was a carcass. Connor appeared at the salon entrance first, ducking slightly through the teak doorframe. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elise had earned in 9 months of scrubbing boats. His hair was freshly styled, his jaw clean-shaven, his entire presentation calibrated to project the image of a worthy successor accepting his inheritance. He smiled at me, and the smile contained everything I needed to see. Relief. Triumph. The barely concealed satisfaction of a man who believed the finish line was in sight. Nicole followed half a step behind. Cream blouse, tailored slacks, her auburn hair falling in calculated waves that framed a face designed to project warmth while calculating angles of escape. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm, no doubt containing the power of attorney documents that would sign my life's work into their hands. "Dad." Connor's voice filled the salon with practiced warmth. "You look tired, but peaceful. I think this is the right decision. Sit down, son." I murmured, gesturing to the chairs with a hand that trembled perfectly. "Both of you. Please." They sat. Connor crossed one leg over the other, relaxed and proprietary, as if he already owned the leather beneath him. Nicole's eyes swept the room once, a quick inventory that lingered on the exits. Professional Abbott. I noted it with clinical interest. "I've been thinking all night," I said, letting my voice drift like smoke. "About your mother. About this boat. She loved this deck in the summer, you know. Bare feet on the teak. She said it felt like standing on something honest." Connor's smile tightened a fraction. Patience straining against greed. "Dad, we can reminisce later. Let's take care of the paperwork first, okay? Then you can rest." Nicole slid the portfolio across the desk with manicured fingers. The leather whispered against the mahogany. "Everything is prepared, Mr. Hale. Full power of attorney, medical and financial. Transfer of controlling shares in Hale Maritime. Signature on the new trust designations." She uncapped a fountain pen and placed it beside the documents. "Just your signature. And all of this becomes Connor's burden instead of yours." I reached for the pen. My fingers hovered over it, trembling. I could feel their anticipation filling the room like static electricity. Connor leaned forward in his chair, his breath slightly quickened. Nicole's eyes tracked my hand with the fixed intensity of a snake watching a mouse. I picked up the pen. I looked at the documents. Then I set the pen down. The tremor stopped. I straightened my spine. I lifted my chin. I looked directly into my son's eyes with a clarity and force that I had not displayed in his presence for 9 months. The transformation was physical, visible, and instantaneous. The dying man vanished. In his place sat the chairman who had built a $45 million empire from a single tugboat. "Tell me something, Connor." My voice did not waver. It did not drift. It cut through the salon like a blade through rigging. "When exactly did you decide that your father's life was worth less than a warehouse?" The color drained from Connor's face in real time. It was like watching the tide pull away from a beach, exposing everything that had been hidden beneath the surface. His uncrossed legs came together. His hands gripped the armrests of the chair. His mouth opened. But nothing emerged. Nicole was faster. Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the calculations spinning behind them, reassessing the situation at machine speed. "Mr. Hale, you seem confused," she said, her voice maintaining its honey coating even as her posture shifted toward the exit. "Perhaps we should come back another ein. Sit down, Nicole," I said, and the command in my voice pinned her to the leather. Or rather, "Sit down, Miss Ashford," the woman who was terminated from Pacific Northwest Pharmacy for manufacturing counterfeit oxycodone prescriptions in 2021. The woman currently purchasing industrial-grade scopolamine from a chemical distributor in Tacoma using the stolen identification of Jake Reeves, a dock foreman my son framed for embezzlement. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the gentle lapping of water against the hull seemed to hold its breath. I opened the first drawer and placed the toxicology report on the desk between us. The paper landed with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the airless room. "Scopolamine," I said. 0.8 milligrams per liter in every glass of water you've prepared for me over the past 9 months. Confirmed by an independent laboratory. Cross-referenced with my blood panel showing chronic exposure consistent with sustained cognitive suppression. Connor's mouth was working, but his vocal cords had apparently disconnected. Nicole's mask cracked for the first time. Her fingers curled against the armrest, like claws seeking purchase on ice. I opened the second drawer. Patricia's audit landed beside the toxicology report with the weight of a verdict, $890,000. I continued, my voice never rising above a conversational tone. Siphoned through 4 shell companies, registered under variations of Nicole's maiden name, executed using my credentials during drug-induced episodes where I was physically incapable of consent, each transfer coinciding precisely with documented memory loss. Connor's head turned toward Nicole. Slowly. The look on his face was not anger. Not yet. It was the dawning recognition of a man who was beginning to suspect that the ground beneath his feet was not as solid as he had believed. "You told me it was untraceable," he whispered to her. And in those 6 words, captured perfectly by the microphones above, my son confirmed everything. Connor's composure did not crack. It shattered. Like a hull striking a reef at full speed, the structural integrity of his performance disintegrated into jagged, desperate fragments. He stood up so fast his chair toppled backward against the salon wall. His hands were shaking, and the carefully constructed mask of the devoted son had been replaced by something raw and ugly. The face of a cornered animal whose only remaining instinct was to redirect the predator toward a different target. This was her idea. He pointed at Nicole, his finger trembling with a fury that was equal parts accusation and self-preservation. All of it. The powder, the transfers, the insurance. "She came to me with the plan, Dad. She said you were dying anyway. She said we were just accelerating what nature had already started." Nicole did not move. She sat perfectly still in her chair, her auburn hair catching the gray light from the porthole, her expression cycling through calculations at a speed I could almost hear. She was not panicking. She was reassessing, searching for the angle that would save her. "Connor, stop talking," she said, her voice flat and clinical. "You're making it worse. Making it worse." He spun toward her, the veins in his neck distending. "You told me there was no way to trace the compound. You told me his blood work would read as natural cognitive decline. You promised me. He said gesterol and the botero. And if gesterol," I said, "stop talking." Nicole's voice cracked like a whip, and for the first time, I saw the true architecture of their relationship. He was not the mastermind. He was the tool. She was the hand that wielded him. And now that the tool had become a liability, she was ready to discard it. I let them tear at each other for exactly 30 seconds. Every word was being captured by the microphones above. Each accusation, another brick in the prison they were building around themselves. Then I opened the third drawer. The surveillance photograph spread across the desk like a tarot reading of damnation. Nicole entering the chemical supplier in Tacoma. Nicole signing the purchase log under Jake Reeves's stolen name. Nicole passing an envelope of cash to Dmitry Volkov in a waterfront bar. Each image, time-stamped and annotated by Frank Callahan's meticulous hand. "But I have something for you too, Connor." I said, and my voice softened into something almost resembling pity. Something Nicole neglected to mention during your little partnership. He turned from her, his chest heaving. His eyes met mine, and for a fraction of a second I saw my son in there. Not the predator. The boy. Confused, afraid. Searching his father's face for an answer he was not going to like. Nicole has been purchasing airline tickets for the past 3 weeks. I said, each word placed deliberately like stones on a scale. International routes. Sao Paulo, then Lisbon. 2 seats, Connor. Only 2. There is no booking in your name on any of them. The blood left his face so completely he looked like a man drowning in clear air. She's not planning to share the money with you, son. I continued. She's planning to disappear with every penny while you stay here holding the bag. The insurance payout. The offshore accounts. The shell companies. They're all in her maiden name. You were never going to see a cent of it. You were just the delivery mechanism. Connor turned to Nicole. The look on his face was something I had never seen before. Not anger. Recognition. The terrible, clarifying moment of a man who has just realized he is the victim in his own crime. That's not true, Nicole said. But her voice had lost its honey. It was metallic now, stripped of performance. He's manipulating you, Connor. He's turning us against each other because he... Then explain the tickets, Nicole. Connor's voice was barely a whisper. Explain why there are only 2 seats. She did not answer. Instead, her body made the decision her mouth could not. She launched from her chair toward the salon door with a sudden, explosive violence that caught even me by surprise. Her heels clattered against the teak deck as she burst into the open air, heading for the stern railing and whatever escape route she had been mapping since the moment the conversation turned. I did not chase her. I did not need to. Now, I said. One word, spoken at normal volume, directed toward the ventilation grill above the desk. The response was instantaneous. The salon door burst inward, and Agent Diana Torres stepped through with her badge held high and her service weapon drawn. Behind her, 2 agents in tactical vests followed with the mechanical precision of men who had rehearsed this entry a dozen times. On the deck, I heard the sharp crack of a bullhorn from the water. The Coast Guard cutter had emerged from the fog like a gray ghost, its searchlight cutting through the mist and pinning the Helena in a circle of white brilliance. 2 rigid inflatables were already in the water, closing the distance to the yacht's stern where Nicole had been heading. She made it as far as the stern railing before the tactical team reached her. I heard scuffling, a sharp cry of protest, and then the sound of metal on metal. Handcuffs. Inside the salon, Connor had not moved. He stood beside the overturned chair, his arms hanging limp at his sides, staring at the toxicology report on the desk as if he could erase it by sheer force of will. When Torres's agents approached him, he did not resist. He simply looked at me with eyes that held a complex cocktail of hatred, shame, and something that might have been the distant echo of grief. "I'm your son," he said, his voice cracking on the word, like a boy who has just been told his dog is dead. I met his gaze. I held it. I let him see exactly what 9 months of poison and betrayal had done to the love I once carried for him so easily. "My son died the day he chose poison over love," I replied. "I don't know who you are." The handcuffs closed around his wrists with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Torres's team led him toward the door, and he went without struggle. His shoulders collapsed inward like a building whose supports have been removed. But at the door, Nicole's voice cut through the fog from the stern deck where they were holding her. It was stripped of all artifice now, a raw, ragged sound that carried across the water like a foghorn. "Ask him about Captain Mercer." "Raymond," she screamed, her voice cracking with a fury that went beyond self-preservation into something older and deeper. "Ask your saint of a father what he did to my grandfather. Ask him why Theodore Mercer put a shotgun in his mouth 2 years after your precious company threw him away like garbage." The name hit me like a rogue wave. Captain Mercer. A name from 15 years ago, buried in the archive of decisions I had made when I was still climbing and still believed that collateral damage was simply the cost of progress. Torres looked at me. Connor looked at me. The fog pressed in from every side, and for the first time since I had taken control of this morning, I did not know what to say. Because unlike everything else Nicole had said, this carried the unmistakable ring of truth. The name followed me off the yacht like a stain that salt water could not wash clean. Captain Mercer. Theodore Mercer. I had not spoken that name in 15 years, and in the chaos of the arrest and the paperwork that followed, I told myself I would deal with it later. But later came faster than I wanted. 3 days after the arrests, with Connor and Nicole both in custody awaiting arraignment, I found myself sitting in the basement archive of Hale Maritime's headquarters. The fluorescent lights hummed above filing cabinets that stretched back 3 decades, each drawer containing the paper trail of every decision I had made in the construction of my empire. I found Mercer's file in the cabinet labeled 2009. It was thin, barely a dozen pages. The kind of file that gets thin when a company wants to forget something quickly. Theodore Mercer. 58 years old at the time of termination. Senior captain. 22 years of service. Spotless record until a single incident report filed by a middle manager named Howard Fisk accused him of operating a vessel while impaired. The accusation was never independently verified. There was no breathalyzer, no blood test, just Fisk's written statement and a recommendation for immediate termination. I had signed the termination order without a second thought. 22 years of service dismissed on the word of one man because I was in the middle of a fleet expansion and did not have time for an investigation that might slow the process. Mercer was collateral, a line item to be closed so I could move on to the next acquisition. I turned the page and found the appeal letter. Mercer had written to me directly. 3 pages, handwritten in the careful, slanted script of a man who had spent his life logging coordinates and weather reports. He asked for a hearing. He asked for the chance to face his accuser. He asked me, personally, to remember the 22 years he had given to the Hale name. I had never read it. My assistant at the time had filed it without bringing it to my attention. Or perhaps she had. And the scopolamine had nothing to do with why I could not remember. Perhaps some things we forget because the truth of them is too heavy to carry. The final document in the file was a news clipping from the Tacoma Tribune, dated 14 months after Mercer's termination. Captain Theodore Mercer, age 59, found deceased in his home. Cause of death: self-inflicted gunshot wound. Survived by a daughter, Karen, and a granddaughter, Nicole Ashford. Born Nicole Mercer. I closed the file. The fluorescent light buzzed above me like an accusation. The basement air tasted of dust and old paper. The accumulated weight of 3 decades of decisions made by a man who believed speed was more important than justice. How many lives did I snap in half on my way to $45 million? How many Theodore Mercers were buried in these cabinets, their stories compressed into thin files and filed under letters I never thought about again? I drove to the cemetery on a Tuesday morning. The November rain had given way to a pale, watery sun that made the gravestones glisten like wet teeth. Tacoma Memorial Gardens sat on a hillside overlooking Commencement Bay, and it took me 20 minutes of walking between rows before I found the marker. Theodore James Mercer. Beloved father and grandfather. Born 1951. Died 2010. Still. Waters run deep. The stone was modest. Gray granite. Weathered by 14 Pacific Northwest winters. Someone had planted daffodils at the base, but they had gone wild, spreading in a tangled yellow mass that the groundskeeper had clearly stopped trying to contain. I stood there for a long time. The wind coming off the bay carried the smell of salt and diesel, the same scent that had followed Mercer through 22 years aboard my vessels. I wondered if he could smell it in the ground. I wondered if that smell was comfort or torment for a man who died believing the sea had rejected him. I didn't read your letter, Theodore, I said aloud. my voice thin against the wind. I should have. You gave me 22 years, and I gave you a signature on a termination form. I didn't even look up from my desk. The daffodils nodded in the breeze. The dead, as always, offered no absolution. Your granddaughter tried to kill me, I continued. And the truth is, I understand why. I don't forgive it. But I understand the shape of the rage that built it. Because I'm the one who poured the foundation for that rage, one ignored letter at a time. I placed the flowers I had brought at the base of the stone. White chrysanthemums, a funeral flower, an apology that came 14 years too late and meant nothing to the man beneath the grass. But it meant something to me. It meant I was no longer the kind of man who drove past the wreckage he created. That afternoon, I sat in Marcus Webb's office and dictated the charter for the Captain Mercer Maritime Workers Foundation, a permanent endowment, funded by my personal assets, dedicated to providing legal defense and financial support for maritime workers facing wrongful termination. Every dockhand, every engineer, every deckhand who found themselves on the wrong end of a company's convenience would have access to representation that Theodore Mercer never received. It would not bring him back. It would not undo the 14 months of despair that ended with a shotgun in a quiet house. But it would ensure that the next Theodore Mercer had someone standing between him and the machinery of men like the one I used to be. You're sure about the name? Webb asked, his pen hovering over the document. The name is the point, Marcus, I replied. I want every dock worker in the Pacific Northwest to know that when Hale Maritime wronged a man, Hale Maritime eventually answered for it, even if it took 15 years and a poisoning to get there. Webb signed as witness. I signed as founder. The ink dried on the page, and I felt something shift in the architecture of my chest. Not relief, not redemption, something quieter, the sensation of a debt being acknowledged, even if it could never be fully repaid. Is it atonement if the dead cannot accept it? I do not know. But I know that the alternative, the silence of a man who never looks back at the wreckage in his wake, is a kind of poison more corrosive than anything Nicole ever dissolved in my water. I left Webb's office and drove south toward the King County Superior Court. Connor's sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m, and for the first time since the arrests, I would face my son across a room where neither of us could pretend. The courthouse steps were wet with recent rain, and the reflection of the gray sky in the granite made the building look like it was sinking into its own foundation. I climbed them slowly, each step carrying the weight of a story I was about to watch end. The courtroom smelled of old wood and floor polish, a scent that reminded me of the churches Helena used to drag me to on Sunday mornings when she was still alive and I was still capable of being dragged. The wooden pews were half full with reporters, a few Hale Maritime board members, and the kind of spectators who attend sentencing hearings, the way some people attend sporting events, looking for blood. I sat in the third row, my hands folded on my lap, my eyes fixed on the empty defendant's chair. The judge had not yet entered, and the room hummed with the low, restless murmur of people waiting for a hammer to fall. When they brought Connor in, he looked smaller than I remembered. The charcoal suit was gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look gray under the fluorescent lights. His wrists were cuffed in front of him, and his hair, usually so meticulously styled, fell across his forehead in limp strands. He scanned the room as they led him to the table, and when his eyes found mine, he held my gaze for 3 full seconds before looking away. Nicole was brought in separately. She sat at a different table with her attorney, her posture rigid and defiant, even in restraints. She did not look at me. She did not look at Connor. She looked straight ahead at the judge's empty bench, as if she could will the proceeding to end by sheer concentration. Judge Patricia Harmon entered at exactly 2 o'clock. She was 63, silver-haired, with the bearing of a woman who had spent 3 decades watching people explain why their worst impulses did not waste time. The charges were read: attempted murder by poisoning, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, embezzlement, forgery, identity theft. The list unspooled like a ship's manifest of human failure. Connor's attorney offered mitigating circumstances. A complicated family dynamic. A client who had been manipulated by a more sophisticated co-conspirator. A man who deserved treatment, not incarceration. Then Connor was given the opportunity to speak. He stood slowly, his cuffed hands hanging before him. He looked at the judge, then at me. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the practiced charm or the manufactured warmth I had endured for 9 months. It was raw, stripped, the voice of a man standing in the ruins of his own choices. My father built the tallest things in this city, he said, his eyes moving back to the judge, but clearly speaking to me. Cranes, warehouses, ships. He built them every day, all day, for 40 years. And when he came home, he was too tired to build anything else. His voice cracked. I'm not saying that excuses what I did. I'm saying that when a man gives you everything except himself, you eventually stop believing you're worth the exception. The courtroom was silent. I sat perfectly still, feeling each word land like a hammer blow against the hull of something I could not repair. You built me into this, Dad, Connor said, finally looking directly at me. You gave me everything except yourself. Judge Harmon waited a full 10 seconds after he sat down before delivering the sentence. 15 years for Connor, 12 for Nicole, with an additional 3 pending federal charges related to the insurance fraud. The gavel struck. The sound echoed. The numbers settled into the record with the permanence of words carved into stone. I did not react visibly. I sat in my pew and let the sentence wash over me like cold water over the deck of a ship. 15 years. My son would be 48 when he emerged. An old man by prison standards. A stranger by any standard. As the bailiff led him toward the door, Connor stopped. He turned his head over his shoulder and looked at me one final time. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I read the shape of the words anyway. I'm sorry. I did not nod. I did not shake my head. I simply let him see my face. And whatever he found there, it was the last thing he saw before the door closed between us. Does a father ever stop being a father? Even when the child has become something unrecognizable? I do not know the answer. I suspect I never will. 2 hours after the sentencing, I stood in the lobby of Hale Maritime Headquarters on Alaskan Way. The building smelled of new carpet and sea air. The plate glass windows reflecting the gray surface of Elliott Bay, like a mirror held up to the city. I was here to perform a different kind of justice. The kind that no courtroom could provide. Dan Kowalski walked in at 4 o'clock, clutching his briefcase the way a drowning man clutches driftwood. He was 30, with the tired eyes of a father who had spent 6 months explaining to his children why Daddy lost his job. Behind him came Jake Reeves, 28, thinner than I remembered, his wedding ring catching the late afternoon light. They stood in the lobby like men waiting for a second execution. They had been told only that Raymond Hale wanted to see them personally. Given what my family had put them through, I could not blame them for expecting the worst. I stepped forward, my footsteps echoing on the marble. I held 2 envelopes in my left hand and 2 contracts in my right. 6 months ago, I looked you both in the eye and called you thieves. I said, my voice carrying across the empty atrium. I signed your termination papers on the word of a man who was using your names to steal from the company you served faithfully. I was wrong. I was poisoned, manipulated, and blind. But none of that excuses the fact that I failed you. I handed each of them an envelope. Inside was a settlement check large enough to cover 18 months of lost wages plus damages. Then, I handed them the contracts. Senior management positions. Fleet. Operations. Real authority, not the performative titles companies hand out to salve their conscience. I didn't just bring you back for your skills, I said, looking into Dan's reddened eyes. I brought you back for your honor. This company needs men who know what it feels like to be wronged and still choose to do right. Dan opened his mouth, closed it, and simply extended his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, and carried the particular weight of a man whose dignity has been returned after a long absence. Jake followed, his jaw tight with the effort of not breaking down in the lobby of the company that had discarded him. I watched them walk toward the elevators, their shoulders straighter than when they had arrived, and felt something realign in the structure of my chest. Not forgiveness for myself, not yet, but the beginning of a balance sheet that might someday approach even. That evening, I convened an emergency board meeting. 3 senior directors who had signed consultation agreements with Nicole's offshore entities were presented with the evidence and given a choice: resign immediately with a non-disclosure agreement, or face criminal referral to Agent Torres. All 3 chose the door. The boardroom table was half empty by 6 o'clock, and for the first time in years, it felt clean. I stood alone in the room afterward, looking out at Elliott Bay through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sun was setting behind the Olympic Mountains, painting the water in shades of copper and steel. I had spent 40 years filling this harbor with commerce. Now it was time to fill it with something harder to measure and infinitely more valuable. Spring arrived in Seattle the way it always does. Not with a single dramatic announcement, but with a gradual loosening of the gray. One morning in late March, I woke in the Bainbridge house and noticed the cherry blossoms had opened overnight, their pale pink petals drifting across the lawn like confetti from a celebration no one had planned. Liam was 4 months old. He had graduated from the fragile, red-faced creature who screamed his arrival into a storm, to a round-cheeked infant with dark, serious eyes that tracked every movement in the room. He had his great-grandfather's birthmark and his mother's quiet intensity. He also had, I noted with private amusement, the Hale stubbornness. When he gripped something, he did not let go. I drove to the offices of Marcus Webb on a Tuesday morning with a document I had been considering since the night Liam was born. The adoption papers were straightforward, a legal filing that would make Elise Whitfield my daughter in the eyes of every court, every institution, and every future challenge that might arise from the wreckage of Connor's imprisonment. Webb raised an eyebrow as he reviewed the pages. "You're sure about this, Raymond? This gives her full standing as your heir. Equal to Connor in every legal proceeding. Superior to Connor." I corrected. Connor forfeited his standing the moment he chose poison over family. Elise earned hers the moment she chose a dock over silence. The signing took 4 minutes. The ink dried, and Elise Whitfield became Elise Hale. Not by blood, but by something stronger. By the shared survival of a war neither of us had chosen. I told her that afternoon, in the living room of the Bainbridge house while Liam slept in his crib and the spring rain tapped gently against the windows. She read the document twice, her lips moving silently over the legal language, before she looked up at me with eyes that held everything she could not say. "You didn't have to do this, Raymond." "I know. That's exactly why I did." She folded the document carefully and pressed it against her chest, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence held the weight of 9 months of darkness and the tentative warmth of whatever came next. 1 week later, I invited her to the Hale Maritime headquarters. We rode the elevator to the executive floor in silence, the mirrored walls reflecting 2 people who had come too far to need small talk. I led her to the corner office that had belonged to the CFO, now reorganized and refurnished with clean lines and new light. "This is the Department of Internal Audit and Ethics," I said, handing her the master key card. "And you are its director. Your first mandate is simple. Make sure no one in this company ever again has the power to do what was done to you. Or to me. Or to Dan and Jake. Or to Theodore Mercer." She took the key card. Its weight small, but its meaning enormous. She sat behind the desk, her posture shifting as the chair accepted her. The woman who had scrubbed barnacles for $8 an hour was gone. In her place sat someone forged by fire into something unbreakable. I won't let them hide in the shadows again, Raymond, she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that reminded me of Helena. I know exactly where they like to live. I know you do, I replied. That's why you're the only person I trust with this. But the day was not finished. I had one more construction project to complete, one more reunion to engineer. I had dispatched Thomas to Montana 3 days earlier with a private charter and instructions that brooked no argument. Find them. Bring them. Tell them nothing, except that their daughter is alive and waiting. At 6 in the evening, the front door of the Bainbridge house opened, and Thomas stepped aside to reveal 2 people who looked like they had been carved from the mountains they came from. Harold Whitfield was 64, broad-shouldered, with hands like saddle leather, and a face mapped by decades of wind and honest labor. June Whitfield was 59, small-boned but fierce-eyed, the kind of woman who could stare down a grizzly bear and send it home apologizing. They stood in the doorway, blinking in the soft light of the hallway, their modest travel bags clutched like shields against a world they did not recognize. They had not seen their daughter in over a year. Connor had told them she was dead. Elise came down the stairs carrying Liam against her shoulder. She was halfway to the landing before she saw them. The sound that escaped her was not a word. It was something older than language. A cry that belongs to the part of us that existed before we learned to speak. The champagne glass she had been carrying shattered on the hardwood. She did not notice. She was already running. June met her at the bottom of the stairs, her arms wrapping around both daughter and grandson with a ferocity that made the walls of the house feel small. Harold followed, his huge hands trembling as they cupped Elise's face, turning it left and right as if checking that she was real and not another cruel dream. "My baby," June whispered, her voice cracking like river ice in spring. "My baby girl. They told us you were gone." "I'm here, Mom," Elise sobbed, her face buried in June's shoulder. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the 3 of them collapse into each other like a structure finding its true center of gravity. Liam, pressed between 3 generations of love, made a small sound of protest at the compression before settling into the warmth. Harold looked up at me over his daughter's head. His eyes were red, his jaw working against emotions that men of his generation were never taught to express. He mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." I nodded. It was enough. Later, after dinner, after Liam had been passed between grandparents who could not stop touching his face, Harold found me on the back porch. The Puget Sound stretched before us in the darkness, the distant lights of Seattle glittering like a fallen constellation. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $5,000, made out to June Whitfield, and a letter. "Your son sent this 18 months ago," Harold said, his voice low and rough as gravel. The letter said if we didn't sign a statement declaring Elise mentally unstable and a habitual runaway, we would never see her alive again. He looked at the check with disgust. $5,000. That's what he thought our daughter was worth. I took the letter. The paper felt cold in my hands. Connor's handwriting. Connor's words. The final shard of broken glass from a man who had apparently believed that every human relationship could be reduced to a transaction. "He was wrong about her value, Harold," I said quietly. "He was wrong about everything." Harold nodded slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He put his hand on my shoulder, the weight of it warm and solid, and squeezed once. A gesture from one father to another. A silent acknowledgement that we had both, in different ways, failed to protect our children from the world, and that we were both, finally, trying to build something better from the wreckage. I sold the house on Queen Anne Hill in April. I did not attend the closing. I simply signed the papers and let the money flow into the Mercer Foundation without looking at the number. The house held nothing for me anymore. Its hallways were haunted by the ghost of a son who no longer existed and the memory of water that tasted like citrus and betrayal. The villa on San Juan Island became my world. A cedar-shingled house perched on a bluff overlooking Haro Strait, where the orcas passed in summer and the eagles nested in the Douglas firs behind the property. Helena and I had found this place 30 years ago on a sailing trip, and she had whispered that it felt like the edge of the earth. She was right. Nothing else mattered now. My days developed a rhythm I had never known in 40 years of commerce. I woke with the light. I made my own coffee in a kitchen that smelled of cedar and salt. I walked the bluff path with Liam in his carrier. The boy's dark eyes wide with wonder. The tremors were gone. Dr. Okafor's protocol had flushed the last of the scopolamine by February. I could remember Helena's funeral now. The memories were painful, but they were mine again. I wrote in the journal every evening. A leather-bound book that was not a memoir but a map. A guide for Liam, to be opened when he was old enough to understand the terrain of the family he had been born into. To my grandson, I wrote one evening as the sun set behind Vancouver Island. Never trust a structure that doesn't account for the soul. The greatest thing I ever built was the bridge back to this family. It cost me more than any vessel I ever commissioned, and it was worth every penny. I wrote about Connor without hatred but without excuses. I wrote about Theodore Mercer and the cost of speed, and I wrote about God. 3 times I returned to that word, because 3 times his hand had been unmistakable. The first was the morning at Fisherman's Terminal, when a fog-brained old man happened to walk past the one dock where his daughter-in-law was scrubbing boats. In a city of 700,000 souls, I found her. Or perhaps he placed her in my path because he knew I was the only one left who could still be reached. The second was the night of the storm, when Thomas threaded the riptide through Goat Island Channel in 10-foot seas and delivered Liam into the world. I do not believe in luck. I believe in grace. And Grace was the only navigator that night. The third was the moment on the yacht, when Connor said those 6 words captured perfectly by the microphones. God does not always save us from our enemies. Sometimes he simply gives them enough rope to reveal themselves. Elise visited every weekend now, driving up from Seattle with reports from the ethics department that made me proud in ways no quarterly earnings statement ever had. Harold and June had moved into a cottage in Friday Harbor, close enough to spoil their grandson daily. On a June evening, she sat on the porch with Liam in her lap. He was gripping her finger with both hands, his face set in fierce concentration. "He has your stubbornness, you know," she said. "He won't let go once he's got something." "Good," I replied. "A Hale should know when he's holding something worth anchoring to." She lifted him toward me. I took him into my arms, his warm weight settling against my chest like ballast in a ship's hold. One small hand released Elise's finger, to find mine instead. His grip was impossibly strong for something so small. I looked down at his shoulder where the blanket had slipped. The birthmark. The anchor. Dark and clear against his pale skin. My father had carried it. His father, before him. The mark had skipped Connor entirely, as if the blood itself had chosen who deserved to carry the family forward. He squeezed. I breathed. The anchor held. Looking back at my family story, I spent decades building an empire but failed to build a relationship with my own son. Do not be like me. Do not measure your worth by the height of your cranes while ignoring the cracks in your hull. I was so focused on constructing a legacy that I did not see the monster I was raising under my own roof. This was not revenge born from hatred. It was survival, and the desperate need to protect an innocent child. But if I had been truly present in Connor's life, maybe he would not have become the man who tried to erase me. I built him a fleet but forgot to teach him that a captain's worth is measured by how he treats his crew. The greatest lesson is simple. Watch who you trust. But more importantly, be someone worth trusting. Your closest circle can become your greatest threat if you prioritize profit over presence. I believe the Lord's timing was perfect. He allowed me to see the truth before the damage became permanent. God does not just save us from our enemies. Sometimes he saves us from the men we used to be. To anyone listening, Do not wait for the poison to reach your bloodstream before you examine your family. Protect your peace. Verify your trust. Remember that blood means nothing without loyalty, love, and the willingness to show up with your whole self. Thank you for walking with me through this entire journey. Please leave a comment sharing your perspective. What would you do if the people closest to you were slowly erasing everything you built? Would you choose justice, mercy, or something in between? If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing so you will not miss future stories exploring trust, betrayal, and redemption. And if someone needs to hear this message today, share it with them, a gentle reminder. While inspired by real-world themes, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this style is not for you, feel free to explore other content. The anchor holds, the harbor is calm, and the tide carries us forward.